Thank you for joining me for Introduction to Qualitative Research. My name is Nicola. I'm a lecturer in rural health and a researcher with the Flinders University Department of Rural Health, and I focus on rural education practices. In this presentation, I will introduce some of the essential ideas in qualitative research. At heart, qualitative research is about understanding. It deals with ideas, practices, contexts, concepts, perspectives, experiences, and meaning, things which are hard to quantify that require us to ask in a different way. Qualitative research is powerful because it can change the way you think about things, both as a reader of research and as a researcher doing the work. To begin, Flinders University acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waters on which our campuses are located. I chose this awesome picture because it reminds me of a paradigm-shifting moment that occurred some 20 years ago, where I attended a research-based presentation that introduced me to an entirely different Indigenous understanding of the night sky. It completely changed the way I thought. To start with a short story. A couple of years ago, I attended a conference and was moving around with another group listening to poster presentations. In this round, the poster that you can see on the slide was presented by a couple of medical students from Griffith Uni, whose modest self-rated survey study revealed a surprising result, that the health literacy of medical students at their institution was lower than that of the general population. Fascinated, I asked why they thought it might be so, and they had no idea at all. The stats demonstrated it, but the stats had no explanatory power. Here were some results crying out for, as they in fact stated in the conclusion, a deeper understanding. So we can appreciate how quantitative research, which has power at scale, and qualitative research, which has power at depth, might hold hands. Qualitative studies can provide explanatory power for statistical studies. They can also raise new questions for further quantitative investigation. Scientific discovery is not about qual versus quant. It needs both. Indeed, a comprehensive research design will likely deliberately sequence qualitative and quantitative studies to explore different aspects of the one phenomenon. Or both qualitative and quantitative approaches can be integrated into a single mixed method study. Indeed, the two approaches overlap in very practical ways. Even in quantitative research, we are making qualitative decisions about what counts as worthwhile data. And even in qualitative analysis, we look for patterns of regularity in the qualitative data. And in the end, this is about limits, judgments, and worthwhileness. Like the great man said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. The qual-quant business is very nuanced, but let me make some generalizations. Like these two images, we could say that in general, qualitative research must make its own path to greater or lesser degrees, and that it aims to explore, to open up, to discover. It paints a picture. On the other hand, quantitative research in general follows more established, proven routes. It deals in facts, it confirms, it proves, and aims to be conclusive. Some say these two approaches occupy different paradigms, but this in itself is a very qualitative thing to say. More on that later. Where we see the qualitative approach made explicit is in the literature. In this presentation, I will use the basic structure of a qualitative research paper, which, as you can see, resembles that of any scientific paper. A qualitative manuscript submitted to a journal undergoes the same level of rigorous peer scrutiny as its quantitative cousin. Peer reviewers of qualitative studies need to see everything spelled out. Even established qualitative methodologies with strong histories are applied quite differently in different contexts. All parts of the study must be explained. For this reason, qualitative papers are often longer and may be written in a narrative style, that tells the story of the research from start to finish, remembering that, of course, any kind of narrative may smooth out the often very unstraightforward and sometimes even emergent processes characteristic of qualitative research. Nevertheless, the academic paper provides a handy linear structure that first builds the argument for the study before describing the study in detail. It puts the study in its proper context, appealing to a certain readership who might be interested in the same problem. It opens the current situation to scrutiny and sets out the need for the research. It describes what the research is concerned with. It delimits itself to certain contexts such as populations, settings, practices, perspectives. It also poses the specific research question which this study will investigate, which is then unpacked as to how in the methodology section to follow. Qualitative research is the home for theories and philosophies. The introduction is the first place these show up because they underpin the whole study. They are the foundation upon which the study and its design makes sense. In this opening statement from a paper I wrote with a colleague, we lay out our philosophical positioning and set the tone for the paper. Philosophies are personal, deeply held, and relatively stable. They relate to beliefs, convictions, commitments, words that you can see in this passage. Theories are intellectual ideas that have been shaped and constructed to work in particular contexts. In this quote from another paper, we can see the presence of theory. Qualitative studies can be founded on an existing theoretical foundation. They can apply, rework, and reframe or problematize existing theories, like this paper does, or they can develop new theories. In qualitative research, the researchers are not separate from the world they are researching. In a very real and living sense, we are part of the research. As individuals, we bring our personal frames or ways of seeing into play, including our experiences, our current understandings, which may be limited, and our biases, which are natural but need to be acknowledged. We are humans researching about being human. Rather than seeing this as a deficit of objectivity, we might regard this as a surfeit of possible meaning. The way to deal with this subjectivist and interpretive inquiry approach is to explicitly declare our beliefs and commitments. But we must also allow the research process itself to take us into new ways of seeing beyond ourselves and what we already know. Yes, the doing of the qualitative research can be transformative. Our personal frames influence the research frames we choose. If we don't think frames belong in research at all, we are probably taking a positivist view. The other frames accept that there are frames. In general terms, constructivists understand the world as a product of cognitive and social forces and conditions. Interpretive researchers look to subjective understandings of the world, and critical researchers reframe existing ideas with new lenses. The pragmatic research lens looks to utility and application as a way of understanding worth, and the phenomenological frame acknowledges frames but attempts to look behind them. When the research frame is deeply held rather than chosen, it is a paradigm, a fundamental way of operating in the world, which makes it hard to see the way that we are seeing, like the fish who cannot see the water that sustains it. As Roger Kneebone points out, for historical reasons, medical education is dominated by a positivist paradigm, which assumes the existence of a single objective external reality. This can seduce us into believing that positivism is not a paradigm at all, but simply how the universe really is. Clinical practice, however, takes place in a much less certain world where reconciling different interpretations of truth is an everyday necessity. For instance, the book series New Paradigms in Healthcare focuses on the shift from biomedical evidence-based practice to a health humanities approach underpinned by the ethos of person-centered care. You may have an opinion on this. I leave it with you. Many journal editors are now insisting on the inclusion of a reflexivity statement in a qualitative paper, often found in the methodology, but not always. The reflexivity section sets out the involvements of the researcher, as this quote says, to self-consciously refer to themselves. Another thing we see increasingly in qualitative papers is first-person voice using I and we pronouns. This style of writing avoids the passive tense we are used to hearing in scientific papers, replacing, for instance, the participants were invited with we invited the participants. The methodology section may be called methods, but methodology refers to the overall approach that underpins the study design. It expresses the theoretical and philosophical positioning in actual applied terms, which includes the methods, the tools and processes used to collect and make sense of the data. This section is descriptive and precise. It should be clear enough that another qualitative researcher might pick up the methods as tools to use in their own context. The methodology section should also reassure the editors and the reader that the study is rigorous and fulfills the basic tenets of research. However, just like qualitative research itself, these tenets are not fixed, but must be appropriate to the task. What counts as good and strong is contestable and constantly maturing and diversifying. Each methodology develops its own guidelines for quality. The tenets of this slide belong to a hermeneutic research frame and use the language appropriate to that frame. Even within the same methodology, we can see how Butler adapted Madison's ideas about quality. These ideas are called markers rather than criteria because they should be discernible in the research as set out in the paper. These are some markers for a particular methodology called self-study research, which I adapted from the original author because some of the descriptors were framed in a critical sociology frame and I was using a phenomenological research frame. One of the places where we look for markers of quality is in the description of the actual method. We need to see a clear description of what data needed to be collected and where it was. Was it in the people or already maybe published in the literature? If you are collecting data from people, a very strict process of human research ethics must be explicit in the paper. How did people give consent? How was their data kept confidential? There is much to get right, and this is guided by the ethics approval process itself. We can think about sources of data as being primary or secondary. Primary data has not been collected before, so it is not available via published datasets or literature. Secondary data is already available, but you may be, say for instance, reanalyzing it with a new research question. A scoping review is a good example of this, as the data you are examining is already published. Many qualitative methodologies combine primary and secondary data sources. Case studies, for instance, might collect novel data from participants and then analyze this together with policy and other published data sources, which together give a comprehensive picture. Surveys, even when they gather open text responses from participants, are not strictly a qualitative method because they are quantitatively organized and analyzed using a fixed architecture of questions. Let's say you want to collect primary data from people. How you collect the data makes a difference. The in-depth interview is an intimate, private conversation based on trust and disclosure. A focus group may be more efficient, but individual experiences may be subsumed into a sense of the shared experience. There may be groupthink, there may be conflict. These interactions can dynamically affect the group members' ideas. Our participant may even change their mind on something based on the experiences of others. However, if the research has a developmental or transformative intention, this may be actually desirable. Observational studies go into the setting and collect data by documenting practices in real time. observational studies may take insider or outsider observational perspectives. Reflective studies put the researcher in the position of the participant. Self-study is one example of this. Sometimes these methods are combined. Whatever is most appropriate for the study is the one to use. In qualitative research, words and ideas are the unit of analysis rather than numbers. Whatever the original form of capture, the data then needs to be rendered into a workable format, which is text. Even images need to be described and interpreted using words so that they can be meaningfully analysed. An audio recording of an interview is transformed into a transcript. A video recording in an observational study will be coded with words to turn it into textual data. Secondary analysis, like published literature and documents, are already in textual form. If you love words, then qualitative research is for you. The textual data is then available for analysis. Many qualitative methodologies refer to this as content analysis, which is performed by coding the data. In this transcript, you can see a very crude example of assigning simple ideas to complex passages of text. You can see that some of this text recounts experiences. Other parts refer to goals, plans, and beliefs. Any two researchers looking at the same text may see different ideas. The methodology you are using will guide this analytical process, helping to frame what you're looking for. There are two main approaches to the analysis of the textual data: inductive and deductive reasoning. A simple way to remember the difference is to use the terms themselves. This is how I do it. The inductive approach looks at the data and enters into it. It uses insight to see what is meaningful within the data. Grounded theory uses this method. It builds theory from the data. Codes are refined and organized as they emerge. The deductive approach looks at the data to see if it contains the ideas that have already been decided and declared that you will look for. These parameters may be framed by the research question or a particular theory that you are looking at or using as a lens. Many methodologies use both inductive and deductive, describing their analysis process as iterative. In the findings or results section, the results of the analysis are then reported. This will be written up as a descriptive narrative. This is where we expect to see the data organized into themes or categories or frameworks. There may be a table of codes. There may be direct quotes from participants. There may be a diagram that illustrates the relationships between the main ideas. At this stage, there is no interpretation as such, although the way the results are organized, of course, unavoidably scaffolds the results in a more or less meaningful way. It is useful to differentiate the two kinds of analysis. The first kind, when organizing the data, is a thematic analysis, and this generally belongs in the findings section. Even while it is suggested by the organization of the data, at this stage the meaning of the data itself is silent. The second layer of interpretive analysis, where meaning comes in, rightly belongs in the next section, the discussion. As Braun and Clark say, the prevalence of themes in the data does not necessarily equate to meaningfulness. A word on themes. Themes and patterns in the data make intuitive sense, but there are other ways to organize the data and other things to report. In fact, you could argue that just reporting the most common ideas in the data introduces a quantitative analysis approach. The art of reporting the findings is not to smooth over the anomalies, but to allow them their place. For instance, in my qualitative research, I look for the energy. What strikes me in the data? What puzzles me? What do I find myself wondering about? Where are the tensions within the data, and where is the energy lacking? These things are worthy of discussion, but to be discussed, they must first show up in the results. In the discussion section, we get to the really interesting bit concerned with the so what. Here the results are discussed in terms of the literature, in terms of the research question, and in terms of implications for practice in particular contexts. Discussion brings into view the new contribution this research has made to the field. It situates that new knowledge in its proper context. It brings multiple perspectives to bear. It raises new questions and acknowledges tensions and complexity. It attempts to understand the data. We are dealing with meaning rather than facts. Have a think about what makes the most sense to you. Do you think that meaning can be found or uncovered or discovered in the data? This implies that the data is already somehow replete with possible meaning, and that with an inductive approach you can recognize and extract that meaning. Or you might think that meaning is constructed, that you make meaning, you make sense of the data that you're working with. You mold meaning from raw materials. You negotiate meaning with other researchers and arrive at a shared meaning. Perhaps meaning involves a bit of both. I leave it with you. Both is fine, because it is true for you. What you experience is a true human experience. Your ideas, opinions, feelings, and stories are valid and valuable. Qualitative research celebrates the variations between people and the enigmatic depths of people. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. In summary then, what can be concluded? This is the section that busy readers jump to. It should draw out and underline the main points and make a statement about the contribution of the research. It should also say what it cannot claim, the limitations of the study. This one study will likely open up new lines of inquiry suggested by the results and by new questions raised from the discussion of the results. The methodology also has a presence here. I refer back to the self-study methodology, which has a sense of humility about the knowledge claims that it makes. In self-studies, conclusions are hard-won, elusive, and generally more tentative than not. The aim of self-study research is to provoke, challenge, and illuminate rather than confirm and settle. Qualitative research claims or conclusions do not necessarily translate into other contexts and cannot be said to be generalizable, but what does carry forward is the way of thinking about a thing. Qualitative research does not really want to conclude. The intention with a qualitative study is to open up new lines of thought and keep the scholarly conversation going. I encourage you to follow your own line of interest and explore the literature with reference to qualitative studies in this area. Does it enrich your understanding? Does it have explanatory power? Does it get you thinking? I leave it with you. Thank you.